I've listened to channels like this for years. I use them as white noise while I work, listening to people describe the worst nights of their lives while I sit safely in my truck, drinking lukewarm coffee. You never think you're going to be the one writing in. You never think the too good to be true job offer is actually going to be the one that almost kills you. But here I am. And if you're listening to this and you work in the outdoors, forestry, surveying, search and rescue, let this be a warning. Some places on a map are blank for a reason. My name is Elias, and I'm a freelance land surveyor. About 6 months ago, I was broke. The kind of broke where you're rotating credit cards to buy gas. So when I got an email from a holding company asking for a rush boundary survey on a 300-acre plot in rural West Virginia, I didn't ask questions. They offered triple my usual rate, half upfront. The only catch was the timeline. They needed the corner markers located and the topography mapped in 3 days. The property was called Blackwood Hollow. I arrived at the access road around 4 p.m. on a Tuesday in late October. The drive itself was a warning sign I ignored. As soon as I turned off the state highway, the road deteriorated from asphalt to cracked gravel, and finally to a rutted dirt track that looked like it hadn't seen a vehicle since the 70s. The GPS on my dash had given up 10 miles back, just displaying a gray void where the road should be. The hollow was heavy. That's the only way I can describe it. It was a deep, V-shaped valley choked with hardwoods and dense underbrush. The sun was already dipping below the ridgeline, casting the entire bowl in a premature twilight. I parked my truck, a lifted Tacoma, thankfully, at the dead end of the trail. I killed the engine, and the silence hit me like a physical blow. Usually, the woods are noisy. You hear birds, wind in the leaves, insects, distant traffic. But Blackwood Hollow was dead silent. No birdsong, no crickets, just the ticking of my cooling engine and the sound of my own breathing. I grabbed my pack and my tripod, intending to hike in and find the first survey marker before I lost the light completely. According to the deed I'd been sent, the southwest corner started at a large iron pin set in stone near the creek bed. I hiked about half a mile into the tree line. The air smelled wrong here, damp, metallic, and vaguely sweet like rotting fruit mixed with copper. The undergrowth was thick, tearing at my pants, and I had this unshakable sensation that the trees were leaning in, crowding me. I reached the creek bed, which was barely a trickle of black, stagnant water. I checked my handheld GPS unit. I was right on top of the coordinates. I started kicking away the dead leaves, looking for the iron pin. My boot hit something hard. "Gotcha," I muttered, kneeling down to clear the dirt. But it wasn't an iron pin. I brushed away the layers of wet, decaying leaves and froze. It wasn't a metal rod marking the boundary. It was a bone. A femur, specifically. It was driven vertically into the mud, deep so only the joint was sticking out. And it wasn't old. The marrow inside looked dark and wet. I recoiled, scrambling back a few feet. What the hell? I stood up, my heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against my ribs. I looked around, scanning the darkening woods. That's when I saw it. About 20 yards downstream, hanging from the low branch of an oak tree, was a shape. I squinted, trying to make sense of it in the gloom. It looked like a wind chime, but crude. I walked a few steps closer, gripping my machete, though I didn't know why I felt the sudden need for a weapon. The wind chime was made of cell phones. Dozens of them. Old Nokias, cracked iPhones, flip phones, all strung together with braided fishing line, dangling silently in the still air. They were covered in grime, some caked in dried mud. They clicked softly against each other as a sudden cold draft swept through the hollow. I stared at them, my brain trying to process the logic. Why would trash be hung up like art in the middle of nowhere? Then one of the cell phones, a shattered smartphone in the center of the cluster, lit up. The screen was broken, but the light was unmistakable in the dusk. It buzzed. A text message. I took a breath
and stepped closer to read the screen, my curiosity overriding my survival instinct. Through the spiderweb cracks, I could make out 3 words. "We see you." And right then, from the ridge directly above me, maybe only 50 yards up the slope, I heard the distinct, deliberate sound of a heavy rock smashing into the earth. Someone was watching me, and they had just thrown something down to get my attention.
My first instinct wasn't a scream, it was a freeze response. My brain locked up, caught between the absurdity of the phone tree and the visceral threat of that rock crashing through the canopy. It had landed close, maybe 10 feet to my left, leaving a crater in the soft mud. That wasn't a pebble kicked loose by a deer, that was a warning shot. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking slightly. I hated how small I sounded in the vastness of that hollow. "I'm a surveyor. I have a permit to be here." Silence. Not the peaceful silence of a library, but the predatory silence of a held breath. I gripped the handle of my machete tighter, my knuckles turning white. I scanned the ridgeline above me, searching for a silhouette and flash of orange hunting gear, anything. But the twilight had turned the trees into a wall of gray and black jagged lines. "I'm leaving," I yelled, backing away slowly. "I'm backing out." I didn't turn my back on the ridge. I shuffled backward, eyes locked on the slope, until the thick brush forced me to turn around. As soon as I did, panic set in. I moved fast, abandoning the careful hiking pace for a clumsy jog. I left the tripod. I left the iron pin locator. I just wanted to get back to the truck. The hike back felt twice as long as the hike in. Every snapped twig sounded like a footstep behind me. Every rustle of the kudzu sounded like a hand reaching out. The smell of the woods seemed to have intensified. That rotting, coppery sweetness was cloying now, sticking to the back of my throat. When the white metal of my Tacoma finally appeared through the trees, I almost collapsed with relief. I scrambled up the embankment, fumbled with my keys, and threw myself into the cab, locking the doors instantly. I sat there for 5 minutes, just breathing, my heart rattling against my ribs like a trapped bird. I checked the mirrors. Nothing but the darkening road behind me and the wall of trees ahead. "Calm down, Elias," I told myself. "Think." I tried to rationalize it. This was West Virginia, deep Appalachia. It wasn't uncommon for locals to use remote hollows for illicit agriculture, weed patches, meth labs. The phone tree? Probably some weird art project by bored teenagers or a boundary marker for a dealer. The rock? A get-lost signal. I looked at the fuel gauge. Half a tank. I could leave. I should leave. But then I looked at the invoice on the passenger seat. $15,000. That was the payout. That money would clear my debts, fix my truck, and keep a roof over my head for 6 months. If I drove away now, I'd get nothing. "It's just rednecks," I muttered, opening the glove box and pulling out my Smith & Wesson 9mm. I checked the mag. Full. I decided I wouldn't work anymore tonight, obviously, but I wouldn't leave yet. I'd sleep in the truck, doors locked, windows up, gun on the dash. In the morning, with the full light of day, I'd grab my gear, finish the topo map from the safety of the ridge, and get the hell out. I reclined the driver's seat and cracked a window a fraction of an inch for air. The sun had gone. Now, Blackwood Hollow lived up to its name. It was pitch black outside, the kind of darkness that presses against the glass. To calm my nerves, I grabbed my digital voice recorder. I needed to log the bone discovery while the details were fresh for the report I'd have to file with the sheriff later. I hit play to listen to the last entry I'd made just before I found the phones. Static, crunching leaves, heavy breathing. "Approaching the creek bed now," my voice said on the recording, tinny and distant. "Vegetation is extremely dense, no sign of the corner marker yet." I listened, remembering the walk. But then, on the tape, I heard something I hadn't heard in the woods. In the background of the recording, underneath the sound of my own boots crunching on the leaves, there was a second sound, faint but rhythmic. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Footsteps. Someone had been walking in step with me, stalking me. I held the recorder up to my ear, pressing play again. Dense, no sign of the corner marker yet.
Then a pause in the recording where I had stopped to wipe sweat off my forehead. In that silence, clear as day, a voice whispered. It was right up against the microphone, as if someone had been standing inches from my shoulder. "He's alone." The voice sounded wet, guttural. I dropped the recorder. It clattered onto the center console. My blood ran cold. I hadn't been alone for a second. They were right next to me. I grabbed the keys, ready to start the engine and get the hell out of there, money be damned. But before I could turn the ignition, a bright light flared up in the rearview mirror. I froze. About 100 yards behind the truck, back the way I had driven in, a massive dead oak tree had been dragged across the road, and it was on fire.
The fire wasn't a wildfire. It was controlled. It was a barrier. The oak tree lay directly across the narrowest part of the trail, the flames licking up the dry bark and sending a column of thick, choking smoke into the canopy. The heat distorted the air, making the woods beyond the fire look like a rippling oil painting. I slammed the truck into reverse, my tires spinning in the loose gravel, but I stopped after 10 feet. Behind me was the dead end of the hollow. Ahead of me was a wall of fire. I was boxed in. "Think, Elias, think," I whispered, my voice trembling. I killed the headlights. It felt counterintuitive, plunging myself into darkness when there was a threat out there. But the Tacoma was a lit-up fishbowl in a sea of black. If I could see them, they could see me. I turned the key to the auxiliary position, keeping the engine off but the power on, and checked the door locks 3 times. Click, click, click. I sank low in the driver's seat, gripping the Smith & Wesson with sweaty palms. The interior of the truck cooled rapidly as the night air seeped in through the vents, but I was sweating bullets. The only light came from the flickering orange glow of the burning tree, casting dancing, elongated shadows against the surrounding pines. That's when I saw the movement. At first, I thought it was just the shadows playing tricks, shifting with the flames. But then, to the left of the fire, a silhouette detached itself from the tree line. Then another. Then a third. They moved strangely, not like hikers or hunters. They moved with a loping, disjointed gait, their limbs seemingly too long for their bodies. They stayed low, crouching near the fire, warming themselves like it was a campfire they had built for a pleasant evening. I squinted, trying to make out details. They were covered in something. Mud? Rags? One of them stood up fully, and my stomach churned. It was wearing clothes, but they were wrong. An oversized flannel shirt that hung in tatters, pants held up with rope. But it was the head that terrified me. It looked like he was wearing a hood made of burlap, or maybe skin. It was tight against the skull with no visible face. Then the sound started. From the darkness to my right, just outside the passenger window, a voice spoke. "I'm a surveyor. I have a permit to be here." My heart stopped. It was my voice. It wasn't a recording. It wasn't the tinny playback of the digital recorder I had dropped. It was a perfect tonal replication of the shout I had given in the woods 20 minutes ago. Same pitch, same cracking fear, but it was coming from a throat that wasn't mine. I whipped my head toward the passenger window. Nothing but darkness pressed against the glass. Then, from the left side of the truck, another voice. "Gotcha." The word I had whispered when I found the bone. This time, the voice was deep, raspy, and wet, like the speaker had a mouthful of sludge. They were mocking me. They had been listening to me the entire time, every mutter, every breath, and now they were playing it back. I raised the gun, pointing it at the passenger window, my hand shaking so hard the sight drifted wildly. "I have a gun!" I screamed, abandoning the stealth approach. "Get away from the truck!" Silence followed. Even the woods seemed to hold their breath. The figures at the fire had vanished, slipping back into the darkness as soon as I yelled. I waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes. The only sound was the popping of the burning oak and the blood rushing in my ears. Maybe I scared them off, I thought, a desperate, irrational hope blooming in my chest. Maybe the gun... Thump. The truck rocked violently on its suspension. Something heavy had just jumped into the back of the pickup. I spun around in my seat, staring through the rear window. The red glow of the taillights, which I must have triggered when I braked, illuminated the bed. Crouched there, staring directly at me through the glass, was one of them. Up close, the hood wasn't burlap. It was a deer's head, skinned and dried, worn like a mask over a human face. The eye sockets were empty black pits.
The man, if it was a man, was naked from the waist up, his skin smeared with gray clay and symbols drawn in something dark and dried. He didn't scream. He didn't try to break the glass immediately. He just tilted his head slowly to the side, like a curious dog. Then he raised a hand. In it was a heavy, jagged rock. He tapped it against the rear glass. Tap, 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 testing the strength. Then he pulled his arm back, muscles coiling like snakes beneath the filth, preparing to swing with full force.
The sound of safety glass shattering isn't like the movies. It doesn't tinkle musically. It's a harsh, crumbling explosion, like a bucket of ice being dumped on concrete. The rock smashed through the rear window, showering the back of my neck and the dashboard with thousands of jagged cubes. The deer-skulled maniac didn't hesitate. He didn't wait to see if I was hurt. He lunged through the broken window, the broken glass shredding the skin of his chest and arms, but he didn't seem to feel it. I screamed, a raw, involuntary sound, and raised the Smith & Wesson. In the confined space of the cab, the gunshot was deafening. It felt like a grenade going off in my hand. The muzzle flash illuminated the interior for a split second in blinding strobe light white. I saw the deer mask inches from my face, the hollow eye socket staring into my soul. The bullet hit him high in the shoulder. The impact spun him partially around, his arm flailing and clipping my ear. He grunted, a wet, animalistic huff, and slumped backward into the bed of the truck. My ears were ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. I scrambled for the door handle, my fingers slick with sweat and shaking violently. Get out. You have to get out. But as I grabbed the latch, a face slammed against the driver's side window. It was another one. A woman this time, or what was left of one. Her hair was matted into dreadlocks with mud and dried blood, and her mouth was stained black. She grinned, pressing her tongue against the glass, smearing it. She raised a rusted tire iron and brought it down on the window. Crack! The glass spiderwebbed but held. She raised it again. "No, no, no!" I yelled. I kicked the door open with every ounce of hysterical strength I possessed. The metal door caught her square in the chest. She flew backward, landing in the gravel with a wheeze. I didn't wait to see if she got up. I tumbled out of the truck, my knees hitting the hard ground, glass shards biting into my palms. I scrambled to my feet, the gun gripped so tight my hand cramped. I swept the area with the barrel, spinning in a panic. They were swarming. In the flickering orange light of the burning tree, I saw at least 5 of them. They were descending on the truck like ants on a dropped candy bar. 2 were already climbing into the bed, where the deer man was recovering. Another was tearing at the passenger door handle. They weren't screaming or shouting battle cries. They were silent, efficient, and utterly terrifying. I couldn't go back to the road. The fire blocked it. I couldn't fight them all. I had maybe 12 rounds left. I turned and ran toward the only open space left, the creek bed. I sprinted blindly into the tree line, crashing through the rhododendrons and briars. Thorns tore at my face and clothes, but the adrenaline numbed the pain. I didn't turn on my flashlight. I knew that a beam of light would just be a beacon, a line connecting them directly to me. I relied on the faint ambient moonlight filtering through the canopy and the terrifying motivation of the footsteps behind me. I ran until my lungs burned, slipping on wet rocks and moss. I splashed through the stagnant creek, the icy water soaking my boots, and scrambled up the opposite bank. I found a depression in the earth, an old rotted-out root system of a fallen giant, and threw myself into it, curling into a ball. I pressed my mouth over my hands to stifle the sound of my ragged breathing. My ears were slowly adjusting, the ringing fading enough to let the sounds of the forest back in. Back at the truck, about 200 yards away, I could hear them. They were destroying it. I heard metal screeching as doors were bent back. I heard the crunch of the windshield being stomped in. They were tearing my vehicle apart, piece by piece, looking for me. Then the destruction stopped. A voice called out. It drifted through the trees, amplified by the acoustics of the hollow. It was the deep, raspy voice I had heard on the recording earlier. "Elias?"
He dragged out the syllables of my name, savoring them. "Come back, Elias. We just want to see the map." Laughter followed, a chorus of it. High-pitched giggles, low grunts, and yips like coyotes. I checked my gun. The slide was in battery. The safety was off. I patted my pockets. I had my phone, no signal, my keys, useless, and a small pen light. I was alone in the dark, miles from civilization, with a pack of feral hunters who knew my name, knew my face, and knew exactly where I was hiding. Because as I lay there in the dirt, trying to make myself invisible, I saw a beam of light sweep over the trees above me. They had flashlights, and they were coming into the woods.
You'd think that with a group of feral maniacs chasing you, the woods would be chaotic. You expect screaming, crashing branches, the sounds of a riot. But that's not what happened. As soon as those flashlights clicked on, the screaming stopped. The taunting stopped. They went silent. And that was infinitely worse. I pressed myself flat into the wet mulch of the root hollow, watching the beams of light slice through the darkness. There were 3 of them, maybe 4, moving in a loose phalanx formation. They were sweeping the area between the truck and the creek. They weren't rushing. They were moving with a terrifying, practiced patience. They knew I couldn't outrun them in the dark, and they knew I couldn't leave the valley. They were scrubbing the woods for me, sector by sector. I realized then that this wasn't a frenzy. This was a harvest. I knew I couldn't stay in the depression. If they kept that grid pattern, they'd be on top of me in 5 minutes. I had to move deeper into the hollow, away from the access road, toward the steep slopes on the far side. I began to crawl. I kept my belly low to the ground, pulling myself forward with my elbows, dragging my legs like dead weight to minimize noise. Every inch was a gamble. The forest floor was a minefield of dry twigs and loose shale. Every time my jacket scraped against a rock, I froze, waiting for a gunshot or a shout. But the wind was picking up, rattling the dry leaves in the canopy, providing me with a chaotic layer of white noise. I moved like that for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only 15 minutes. My clothes were soaked through with freezing mud. My hands were numb. I paused behind the trunk of a massive rotted chestnut tree to catch my breath. I looked back. The flashlights were still back near the creek, but they had spread out. Then, from the darkness to my left, no more than 30 feet away, I heard a sound. Click, click, whistle. It sounded like a bird, maybe a mimic of a blue jay, but the rhythm was all wrong. It was too mechanical. From my right, closer to the ridge, another sound answered. Whistle, click. They were communicating, triangulating. They were flanking me. Panic surged again, hot and acidic. I scrambled up into a crouch, abandoning the crawl. I needed verticality. I needed to get up the slope where the terrain was rougher, where maybe they couldn't move as fast. I turned and took a step, and my boot snagged on something. I pitched forward, throwing my hands out to catch myself, barely stopping my face from smashing into a rock. I scrambled to free my foot, thinking I'd caught a vine. But when I reached down, my fingers brushed against cold, tight wire. It wasn't a vine. It was a snare. I froze, tracing the line with my hand in the dark. It was a tripwire, strung expertly between 2 saplings about 6 inches off the ground, and it was attached to something heavy suspended in the trees above. I looked up. Swinging gently in the breeze, hidden in the gloom, was a log studded with rusty railroad spikes. If I had been walking upright, moving with any speed, that log would have swung down and taken my head off. I backed away, trembling. The woods were rigged. This wasn't just where they lived. This was a kill box. They had spent years, maybe decades, turning this hollow into a fortress of traps. Click, click, whistle. The sound was closer now, much closer. I moved faster, abandoning caution for speed. I scrambled up the incline, my boots slipping on wet slate. The trees began to thin out as the elevation rose, replaced by thick, choking kudzu vines that draped over everything like green ghosts. I broke through a wall of brush and stumbled onto something flat. It was pavement, cracked, broken and reclaimed by moss, but definitely asphalt. I looked up, gasping for air.
I had stumbled into the main street of the old coal camp. It was a ghost town. Skeletal structures loomed out of the fog, rows of collapsing company houses with their roofs caved in, staring at me with empty black windows. In the center, dominating the skyline against the moon, was the massive rusting hulk of the coal breaker, looking like a dark cathedral of iron. It looked like a nightmare, but to me, it looked like a fortress. If I could get into one of those concrete structures, maybe I could hold them off until daylight. I started running down the broken street toward the largest building. But as I passed the first row of ruined houses, a floodlight snapped on from the roof of the coal breaker. It blinded me, pinning me against the asphalt like a bug on a slide. A loudspeaker, old and crackling with static, screeched to life, echoing across the entire valley. "Run, surveyor, run."
The light didn't just blind me, it exposed me. I felt like a specimen pinned to a corkboard. The sudden artificial brightness in the middle of that desolate wilderness was more jarring than the darkness had been. It meant they had power. They had infrastructure. This wasn't just a campsite for drifters. This was a compound. I didn't think. I reacted. I threw myself to the right, diving through the rotted doorway of the nearest structure, a brick building that might have been a payroll office or a company store 80 years ago. I hit the floor hard, sliding on a layer of wet, decaying plaster. Outside, the loudspeaker clicked off, leaving only the low, throbbing hum of a diesel generator somewhere deep in the complex. It was a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. I scrambled into the corner, behind the remains of a heavy oak counter, and brought my gun up. I wiped the sweat and grit from my eyes, trying to blink away the afterimage of the spotlight. The inside of the building smelled atrocious. It was a concentrated stench of unwashed bodies, spoiled meat, and something chemical, like bleach trying to cover up rot. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I realized why. This wasn't just a ruin, it was a storage unit. The moonlight filtering through the shattered windows illuminated piles of stuff. It looked like a lost and found from hell. There were stacks of backpacks, modern ones, Ospreys and North Faces piled floor to ceiling against the far wall. There were hiking boots tied together by their laces, dozens of pairs hanging from exposed ceiling beams like sausages in a butcher shop. And on the wall, directly across from me, nailed into the crumbling plaster, was a collage. I squinted, leaning forward slightly. It was a collection of driver's licenses. There were rows of them, maybe 50, maybe more. Some were faded and yellowed, dating back to the 90s. Others looked brand new. I saw faces of smiling men and women, people who had probably gone missing on solo hikes or hunting trips in this quadrant of the state. I wasn't the intruder here. I was just the latest delivery. Crunch. The sound of glass breaking on the front porch froze the blood in my veins. They were here. I pressed my back against the damp wood of the counter, holding my breath until my lungs burned. Through the gap between the counter and the floor, I could see the doorway. A pair of legs stepped into the shaft of moonlight. The figure was wearing heavy work boots, boots that looked too new, likely stolen from one of the piles. He wore filthy cargo pants, but his torso was bare, revealing a map of scars and tattoos that looked like they'd been carved with a knife rather than inked with a needle. He stopped in the center of the room. He didn't speak. He just sniffed the air. Sniff. Sniff. It was primal, like a hound scenting a fox. He turned his head slowly, scanning the room. He was holding something in his hand, a machete, rusted and jagged. He took a step toward the counter. My grip on the pistol tightened. I had a clear shot at his kneecap. If he took 2 more steps, I'd have to take it. But then, a whistle cut through the air outside. It was the same mechanical bird call from the woods. Whistle, click. The man in the room froze. He chattered something back, a series of clicks and grunts that sounded like a distorted language, and spun around, sprinting back out the door. I didn't wait to see where he went.
I knew how hunting parties worked. One flushes the prey, the others wait at the exit. They were clearing the buildings one by one, driving me towards something. I looked at the back of the room. There was a heavy iron door hanging off its top hinge, leading into darkness. I crawled toward it, keeping low. I slipped through the gap and found myself in a narrow hallway that smelled of wet earth. At the end of the hall was a hole in the floor, a collapsed section of timber leading into a crawl space or a basement. It was a terrifying option, but the street was lit up, and the front door was watched. I holstered my gun and lowered myself into the hole. I dropped about 4 feet, landing in soft, sucking mud. I was under the building now, in the crawl space. Above me, I could hear heavy footsteps thundering across the floorboards. They were swarming the room I had just left. I began to army crawl through the filth, moving toward the rear of the structure. The space was tight, claustrophobic, filled with cobwebs that stuck to my sweating face. I reached the edge of the foundation and peered out through a missing ventilation grate. I was looking at the back of the coal breaker, that massive cathedral-like factory I had seen earlier. The generator noise was louder here. And then I saw where they were taking the things they found. Between my building and the breaker was a courtyard. In the center of it was a pit, a fire pit. 2 of the feral men were dragging something toward it. A body. It was limp, dressed in a surveyor's high-vis vest. My stomach dropped. It wasn't me. It was... Wait. I looked closer. The vest was orange. Mine was yellow. This was someone else. Someone they had caught recently. Maybe the reason they needed a rush job on the survey was because the last surveyor had disappeared a week ago. The men dumped the body next to the pit. The figure groaned. He was still alive. And standing over him, holding a gas can, was the man with the deerskull mask. He looked toward the building I was hiding under, almost as if he could see through the bricks. He raised the gas can.
There is a specific kind of helplessness that washes over you when you witness something truly evil. It's not the adrenaline-fueled panic of being chased. It's a cold, heavy paralysis. I watched from that crawl space, frozen in the mud, as the man in the deerskull mask unscrewed the cap of the red gas can. The liquid glugged out, heavy and dark in the floodlight, splashing over the man in the orange vest. The smell hit me seconds later, acrid, stinging gasoline fumes mixing with the damp rot of the hollow. The man on the ground sputtered. The cold liquid woke him up. He coughed, tried to sit up, and realized his hands were bound behind his back with wire. He looked up, squinting against the glare, and saw the mask looming over him. "Please," the man croaked. His voice was broken, desperate. "I have a family. Please." Deerskull didn't speak. He didn't taunt him. He just tossed the empty can aside. It clattered loudly on the pavement. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a road flare. I gripped my gun. My brain was screaming at me. Shoot him, shoot the leader, save the guy. But my body wouldn't move. I did the math in a split second. I was 50 yards away, shooting a handgun through a metal grate with shaky hands. If I missed, or even if I hit him, the 10 other maniacs surrounding the pit would be on me in seconds. I wouldn't save him. I would just join him. So I did the hardest thing I've ever done. I stayed quiet. Deerskull cracked the flare. It hissed to life, sputtering red sparks. He dropped it casually onto the surveyor's chest. The result was instantaneous, a whoosh in ignition, followed immediately by a scream that I will never, ever be able to scrub from my memory. It wasn't human. It was the sound of pure, white-hot agony. The figure in the orange vest thrashed, rolling in the dirt, a living ball of fire. The clan didn't look away. They stepped closer. They watched the flames with a fascination that was almost religious. They were mesmerized. "Now," my survival instinct whispered. "They're distracted. Move." I forced my eyes away from the burning man. Tears were streaming down my face, hot and angry. I hated myself for leaving him, but I used his suffering as my cover.
I kicked the ventilation grate loose. It was already rusted through, and shimmied out of the crawl space on the side of the building furthest from the fire. The generator's hum was louder now, a rhythmic thumping coming from inside the massive iron structure. Kill the lights, I thought. If I kill the lights, I level the playing field. I sprinted across the gap between the buildings. I felt exposed, naked, waiting for a bullet or a shout. But the screams from the courtyard were still echoing, covering the sound of my boots on the gravel. I reached the side door of the coal breaker. It was jammed open with a rusted, devastating gear. I slipped inside. The noise was deafening. The interior of the factory was a cavernous hollow of steel beams, catwalks, and chutes. It was like standing inside the rib cage of a mechanical whale. The air was thick with diesel fumes. High above me, suspended from the ceiling beams, were floodlights, the ones illuminating the town outside. The power cable snaked down the wall to a massive industrial generator sitting on a concrete pad about 50 feet away. It was chugging away, vibrating the floor. Next to it was a 55-gallon drum of diesel. I crept toward it, keeping to the shadows of the machinery. I needed to find a kill switch or just shoot the control panel. I was 10 feet away when I stopped. On the floor, circling the generator, were bones. Not random piles, patterns, spirals of vertebrae, triangles of femurs, and in the center of the bone circle, sitting on a wooden crate right next to the generator's control panel, was a baby monitor. It was on. The little green light was pulsing. From the speaker of the baby monitor, I heard a voice. It was clear, crisp, and terrifyingly familiar. "He's in the breaker. Top floor. Flush him out." I froze. The voice wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from a walkie-talkie or another monitor somewhere else in the building. They weren't just guarding the outside. They had a spotter inside the factory, up in the rafters, watching the generator. I looked up, scanning the dark maze of catwalks high above me. A single drop of something wet landed on my cheek. I wiped it off and looked at my hand. It was red, fresh blood. I looked straight up again. Directly above me, straddling a steel beam like a spider, was a figure. He was grinning, his teeth filed to points. He let go of the beam.
Gravity is a brutal thing. When the man dropped from the rafters, he didn't land like a cat. He landed like a sack of wet cement, slamming directly onto my shoulders. The impact drove the air from my lungs and flattened me against the concrete floor. My pistol went skittering across the oil-slicked slab, disappearing into the shadows under the generator. I rolled onto my back, gasping, but he was already on me. Up close, the smell was unbearable, a mixture of stale sweat, dried blood, and something musky, like a wet dog. He didn't have a mask. His face was a ruin of scars, his nose broken and healed crookedly so many times it was just a lump of cartilage. He snarled, a spray of saliva hitting my face, and brought the knife down. I threw my forearm up, blocking his wrist. The tip of the blade stopped inches from my left eye. He was strong, wire-strong, the kind of hysterical strength you find in meth addicts or starving animals. I could feel his weight pressing the breath out of me, his knees digging into my ribs. "Hold him!" the baby monitor screeched from the crate nearby. "Hold him down!" I screamed, a primal, angry sound, and bucked my hips, trying to throw him off. He shifted his weight, raising his other hand to claw at my eyes. My right hand flailed around on the floor, searching for a weapon. My fingers brushed against something heavy and cold. A wrench, a massive industrial pipe wrench left behind by the workers who built this place 80 years ago. I gripped the handle. As he lunged down to bite my throat, I swung the wrench with every ounce of panic-fueled adrenaline I had left. Crack! The iron struck him in the temple. The sound was sickening, like stepping on a dry branch. His eyes rolled back instantly. His grip slackened and he slumped sideways, dead weight. I shoved his body off me and scrambled backward, crab-walking until my back hit the generator. I was hyperventilating, wiping his spit and blood off my face. I looked around wildly for my gun. I saw the glint of the barrel near the diesel drum. I grabbed it, checked the chamber, and stood up. My knees were shaking so hard I could barely stay upright. From the open doorway leading to the courtyard, I heard shouting. The Burning Man had stopped screaming, but now a dozen voices were yelling. They had heard the struggle. I couldn't go out, and I couldn't stay here. I looked up.
The coal breaker was a vertical maze of crushers, shakers, and conveyor belts. The only way was up. I sprinted toward the rusted metal staircase that spiraled around the central machinery. I took the steps 2 at a time, the metal grating clanging loudly under my boots. Every step sent a vibration through the structure, announcing my position to everyone in the valley. I reached the second-level catwalk just as the first wave of the clan burst through the ground floor doors below. I peered through the grating. In the harsh light of the floodlights, they looked like demons. They swarmed the generator room, crowding around the dead body of their scout. One of them, the leader with the deer skull, looked up. He pointed a long, bony finger directly at me. "Block the exits," he roared. His voice wasn't a mimicry this time. It was his own, deep, commanding, and terrifying. "Bring him down, alive." I didn't wait. I ran. The catwalks were a nightmare. Sections of the railing were missing, offering a 50-foot drop onto the grinding gears below. The air grew hotter as I climbed, heat rising from the machinery and the summer humidity trapped in the roof. On the third level, I stumbled into what looked like a foreman's office. The glass walls were shattered, but the roof was intact. I ducked inside, needing a split second to check my bearings. What I saw inside stopped me cold. It was a control room, but not for coal. On a row of dusty desks sat a sophisticated array of electronics that had no business being in a ruin. There were ham radios, police scanners, and signal boosters powered by car batteries daisy-chained together on the floor. But the worst part was the wall. Pinned to the corkboard were maps, topographical maps of the entire region. They were covered in pins and red string, marking hiking trails, camping spots, and ranger stations. And on the desk, a laptop was open. It was connected to a series of directional microphones that were seemingly rigged throughout the woods. On the screen, I saw audio waveforms. I realized then that the mimicry wasn't some supernatural skinwalker magic. It was technology. They were recording us. They had directional mics in the trees. They recorded hikers, campers, surveyors, capturing our voices, cutting them up, and playing them back through hidden speakers to disorient and herd us like cattle. It was an industrialized murder. Clang, clang, clang. Heavy boots on the stairs. They were coming, fast. I scrambled out of the office, back onto the catwalk. I was near the top now, the processing level where the raw coal would have been dumped onto the sorting belts. I reached the end of the walkway, dead end. To my left was a solid brick wall. To my right, a sheer drop to the concrete floor, now swarming with the clan. In front of me was a massive rusted steel chute. It was a conveyor housing, angling sharply downward at a 45-degree angle, disappearing into the darkness outside the building. It was the waste chute, designed to dump slate and rock onto the hillside behind the factory. I could hear the breathing of the men on the stairs behind me. They were on the landing, maybe 20 feet away. I looked at the black mouth of the chute. I had no idea where it went. It could be blocked. It could lead to a jagged pile of metal. It could drop me off a cliff. But behind me, the deer skull man stepped on the catwalk, holding a coil of rope and a machete. He didn't rush. He knew I was cornered. He tilted his head, and in my own voice, recorded from earlier that night, he whispered, "Gotcha." I looked at him, then at the chute. "Not yet," I whispered. I holstered my gun, crossed my arms over my chest, and threw myself into the darkness of the steel tunnel. The slide down that chute was the longest 10 seconds of my life. It was like being swallowed by a mechanical snake. The metal was cold and slick, polished smooth by decades of coal and rock. But the rivets were rusted. They tore at my clothes, snagging my jacket and scraping the skin off my elbows. It was pitch black. I was tumbling, bouncing off the sides, completely disoriented. The roar of my own body sliding against the steel was deafening, amplified by the enclosed space into a thunderous rumble. Then, the floor vanished. I shot out of the end of the chute like a bullet. There was a brief, weightless moment where I flailed in the cool night air, and then I hit the ground. I didn't land on grass. I landed on a slag heap, a massive, unstable pile of discarded shale and razor-sharp rock waste. I hit the slope hard, rolling uncontrollably. The rocks sliced at my hands and face. I felt something in my left ankle pop, a sickening, wet snap that vibrated all the way up to my hip. I came to a stop at the bottom of the pile, half buried in loose shale, staring up at the night sky. For a moment, I couldn't move. The pain in my leg was blinding, a white-hot spike that made me want to vomit. I lay there, gasping, waiting for the shock to wear off. "Get up," a voice in my head screamed. "Get up or die." I rolled onto my stomach and pushed myself up. My left leg collapsed immediately, sending another wave of nausea through me. I bit my lip so hard I tasted copper. I had to drag myself. I looked back up the slope. The coal breaker loomed above me, a dark silhouette against the moon. From the mouth of the chute high above, a beam of light shot out, then another. They were coming down. Some were sliding, hooting and hollering like kids on a playground slide. Others were sprinting down the side of the slag pile, their boots crunching loudly on the loose rock. I scanned my surroundings. I was behind the factory now, in a narrow gorge that cut through the mountain. And there, running parallel to a stagnant black river, were train tracks. They were old, the wooden ties rotted and the rails rusted brown, but they offered a clear path away from the complex, a path through the thickest part of the forest where the underbrush couldn't grab me. I scrambled toward the tracks, using my good leg to hop and my hands to claw at the dirt. I reached the gravel bed of the railway and forced myself into a loping, broken run. Every time my left foot touched the ground, my vision blurred with pain, but the adrenaline was acting as a crude anesthetic. I ran until my chest felt like it was filled with broken glass. The sounds of the pursuit were getting louder. They were faster than me. They knew this terrain. They were born in it. Whistle, click. The signal came from the tree line to my left. Click, whistle, from the riverbank to my right. They were boxing me in again. They were herding me along the tracks. I rounded a bend in the rails and saw it. About 100 yards ahead, the tracks disappeared into the side of the mountain. A tunnel. The mouth of the tunnel was overgrown with vines, looking like a black throat waiting to swallow me. But it was a choke point. If I could get in there, they couldn't flank me. I could hold the entrance. I pushed harder, my breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. 50 yards. 30, 10. I threw myself into the darkness of the tunnel, spinning around immediately to face the entrance. I raised the Smith & Wesson, steadying my shaking hand against the damp brick wall. I waited. The moonlight illuminated the tracks outside. I saw shadows darting between the trees. Then, one by one, they stepped onto the tracks. There were 6 of them. They formed a line, blocking the exit. They didn't advance. They just stood there, breathing heavy mist into the cold air. Then the ranks parted. The leader, Deerskull, walked through the center. He ditched the mask. His face was painted in black grease, his eyes wide and frantic. He wasn't carrying a weapon anymore. He was holding something else. He held up a small black object, a remote control. He smiled, his teeth yellow and jagged in the moonlight. "Surveyor," he boomed, his voice echoing off the tunnel walls. "Do you know what this tunnel was used for?" I didn't answer. I lined up the sights on his chest. "Ventilation," he said, taking a step closer. "For the mines below. Methane ventilation." He held up the remote. It looked like a detonator for blasting caps. "You're not in a tunnel, Elias. You're in a chimney." He pressed the button. A spark flared deep inside the tunnel behind me. A thump of air pressure hit my back. I didn't have time to think. I didn't have time to shoot. The air inside the tunnel ignited. It wasn't a massive explosion. It was a flash fire. A wave of blue and orange flame roared to life 50 feet behind me, feeding on the pockets of old gas trapped in the ceiling. The pressure wave hit me like a sledgehammer, lifting me off my feet and throwing me out of the tunnel mouth. I flew through the air, flailing, and slammed into the gravel tracks right at the feet of the Deerskull man. My gun skittered away into the darkness. My ears were ringing so loud I couldn't hear my own scream. My jacket was smoking. I tried to crawl, but a heavy boot slammed down on my chest, pinning me to the rails. I looked up. The leader stood over me, looking down with a mix of pity and hunger. He pulled a long, curved skinning knife from his belt. He knelt down, placing the blade against my throat. The metal was ice cold. He raised the knife high, preparing to drive it down into my chest.
I closed my eyes. I didn't want to see the knife coming down. I didn't want the last thing I saw in this world to be the face of a madman mocking me with my mother's voice. I braced myself for the cold bite of steel, the heat of blood, the end. But the blow never landed. Instead, the ground beneath us bucked. It wasn't a tremor, it was a convulsion. The first explosion inside the tunnel, the one that had blown me out, had been methane, a gas pop. But methane explosions in coal mines have a nasty side effect. They kick up coal dust. And coal dust, when suspended in the air and ignited, doesn't just burn, it detonates. A low, guttural roar emitted from the mouth of the tunnel, a sound so deep I felt it in my bone marrow. The leader's eyes went wide. He looked up from my chest, his mimicry forgotten, just as the mountain cleared its throat. The secondary blast hit us like the fist of God. It blew the entire brick archway of the tunnel entrance apart. A wave of superheated air, soot, and shrapnel erupted outward. The leader was lifted bodily off of me and thrown backward like a rag doll, disappearing into a cloud of black dust and fire. I was slammed sideways, rolling down the steep embankment toward the river. I didn't stop rolling. I crashed through the briars, hitting rocks and roots until the ground disappeared, and I hit the freezing black water of the river. The shock of the cold was instant, paralyzing agony. The current seized me, dragging me under. I tumbled in the darkness, my lungs burning, swallowing mouthfuls of silt and coal ash. I didn't try to swim. I couldn't. My leg was broken, my body beaten to a pulp. I just let the river take me. I remember seeing the surface of the water glowing orange from the burning woods above, and then nothing. I woke up 2 days later. I was in a hospital bed in Charleston. There were tubes in my arms and a brace on my leg. A state trooper was sitting in a plastic chair in the corner reading a magazine. When I woke up, I started screaming. I couldn't stop. It took 3 nurses to hold me down and sedate me. When I finally came back to reality, the trooper took my statement. I told him everything. The phone tree, the traps, the coal breaker, the burning surveyor, the clan of feral mimics who hunted people for sport. He listened quietly, scribbling in his notebook. He didn't interrupt, but when I was done, he just closed the book and sighed. "Son," he said, "we found your truck. It was torched, like you said. We found it on the access road." "And the coal breaker?" I asked, my voice rasping. "The bodies?" He shook his head. "We sent a team up to the coordinates you gave. There's an old coal camp there, sure, but it's been abandoned for 50 years. The structures are unstable. We couldn't safely enter the breaker, but the drone flyover showed nothing. No generator, no computers, no bodies." "They cleaned it," I whispered. "They have a system." "We found some disturbance," the trooper admitted, looking uncomfortable. "Some animal bones, but no human remains. As for the explosion, looks like a pocket of methane let go on its own. It happens." They didn't believe me. Or maybe they did, and they just didn't want to deal with what it meant. They ruled it a misadventure. They said I must have hallucinated from the stress, the isolation, and the concussion from the explosion. I stopped arguing. I realized that if I kept pushing, they'd lock me up in a psych ward. So I took my discharge papers, I took the insurance payout for my truck, and I left West Virginia. I moved to a city, a loud, crowded city where it's never quiet and there are no trees. I thought it was over. But 3 nights ago, I got a voicemail. My phone didn't ring, it just showed a missed call from an unknown number. I sat in my apartment, staring at the notification. My hands started to shake. I shouldn't have listened to it. I should have deleted it. But I pressed play. There was static at first, the sound of wind blowing through dead leaves. Then a rhythmic, mechanical clicking. Click, click, whistle. And then a voice. It wasn't the raspy voice of the leader. It wasn't the mom voice. It was my voice, recorded from the hospital room, recorded while I was telling the trooper my story. "We found your truck.
My own voice echoed from the speaker, twisted and distorted. We sent a team, no bodies. Then a pause and a whisper close to the microphone. Good boy, Elias. You didn't tell them enough. The call ended. I don't go into the woods anymore. I don't drive on back roads, and when I hear the wind whistling through the trees, I don't stop to listen. I run, because I know they're still out there in Blackwood Hollow. They're still hunting, and they're still listening.